Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and today our guest is Professor Philip Gorski, a professor of sociology and co-director of the Center for Comparative Research at Yale. Professor Gorski is a comparative historical sociologist, and his research focuses on topics such as state formation, nationalism, revolution, economic development, and secularization, with particular attention to the interaction of religion and politics. Which leads us to the topic we will be discussing today, civil religion. Welcome, Professor Gorski.
Thank you very much, Marilyn.
So, what is civil religion?
Well, civil religion is a way of thinking about what the proper relationship between religion and politics should be. And I think to get a full sense of what civil religion is, it's helpful if we come at it from a number of different angles. So one way of thinking about it is if we imagine religion and politics as sort of separate spheres or systems within a society, we can imagine them having different relationships to one another. Civil religion understands that relationship as one of being relative autonomy, which is to say that they're distinct systems, but they have an area of overlap between them. And this sets it apart, for example, from what might be called liberal secularism or total separationism, which says that religion and politics should have absolutely nothing to do with one another. And it also sets it apart from what I call religious nationalism, which is the notion that the religious and the political communities should be exactly the same. Another way of thinking about it is historically. Because in any particular country, civil religion will be a particular tradition that draws on a certain stock of symbols and stories and rituals. And what exactly is in that toolkit is something that is a product of a specific national history. So in the case of American civil religion, I see it as having two main sources: what I would call the covenant theology of the Puritans and the civic republicanism of the founding fathers. Now, what do I mean by covenant theology? Well, many of the original Puritan theologians and preachers imagined the U.S., or at least New England, as a kind of a new Israel. That is, as a sort of a chosen people that had a sacred covenant with God. And that if they remained true to that covenant, God would remain bound to them and would bless them. And if they deviated from that covenant, they would be rebuked and punished and scolded. The civic republican tradition of the founding fathers envisioned the United States more as a new Athens, if you will. And their fundamental notion was that the success of the American experiment in democracy and self-government required not just good institutions, but required also a virtuous citizenry. And what they understood by virtue was really two things. One, sort of a willingness to take bold action on behalf of the community, but also a kind of cultivation of self-restraint and self-discipline. They saw these as really sort of two sides of the same coin. Now, interestingly, I think that these two traditions, although certainly historically distinct, are actually very complementary to one another. There are certain places in which they converge, and in particular on 2 points. One, the notion that a community is more just than the sum of individuals, that it has a certain kind of reality of its own, and that the sort of health and survival of a vigorous Republican political community requires certain kinds of the cultivation of certain kinds of moral virtues on the part of the population. And these two things, I think, have been largely blended together then in American history. The third and final way that I would approach civil religion is as a certain kind of political or normative stance. It's a certain way of understanding what religion is about and how it should properly relate to politics, and it's a certain way of understanding politics and how politics should properly relate to religion. So from the religious side, I think there are really sort of three things that I would single out. One of them is, again, kind of activism, and this is the notion that, that religion imposes a duty on believers to try to alleviate suffering and to improve the world in some way. So it's not sort of the world is a horrible, sinful place, let's turn away from it, let's retreat into our own communities, and wait for, you know, the return of Jesus or something like that. Another thing it involves is a certain measure of humility, and I think this in this Puritan tradition comes from a kind of a profound sense of the sinfulness and limitations of human beings. That though people are devoted to trying to improve the world, that the world is in some ways a kind of not easily moldable. Simply because of the way that human beings are. And the last thing that I would emphasize is engagement, which I think follows from the previous two, which is kind of a willingness to open up with and deliberate with people who think differently, with non-believers or people who you might consider to be heterodox in one way or another. And that is certainly something that comes after the Puritans, because they would not have been open to that kind of engagement. From the political side, I think I've touched on some of the main points already, but the main things I would emphasize here are an emphasis on engagement and restraint, so that we see self-government as an experiment that we're engaged in collectively with other people, that requires us to sort of open up and deliberate with people, but also to be restrained and civil in our deliberations with those other people. So in sum, civil religion, as I understand it, is a certain way of understanding the relationship between religion and politics. It has a certain understanding of the way in which religious institutions and political institutions and communities should relate to one another. It's also refers to a certain kind of tradition within American politics. And finally, it's a certain kind of ethical or normative position that we take in our dealings with others in politics.
So can you give us some examples of civil religion that we might see today?
I can. And the one that I would point to actually is the presidential campaign of Barack Obama, which is what actually got me interested in looking at this subject and re-examining it again. And here I would point in particular to the speech on race that he gave in Philadelphia following the uproar around the Jeremiah Wright tapes. You may remember that the opening line of that speech, which was delivered at the convention, the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, was taken directly from the preamble of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. And immediately, the place and the oratory already evokes two of the most sacred things within American history. The Constitution, which is one of the two most sacred documents in American political history, and of course this is taking place across the street from Independence Hall, where the Constitution was actually written, none of which I'm sure was a coincidence. And what he's talking about then is a more perfect union between the races. And what's interesting here is that he immediately shifts within a few lines in the speech also into a kind of a Puritan register as well. Here echoing Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address and also the writings of Frederick Douglass. He talks about the Constitution as a document that was flawed by what he calls the stain of the original sin of slavery. And so using this very explicitly religious language, which also sort of evokes this notion of a covenant that's unfulfilled, that that there was a certain kind of political covenant that was embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, a commitment to equal rights for all people, which was then violated immediately by the recognition of slavery in the Constitution, the 3/5 rule, so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting here, though, is that he's not just evoking the language of American civil religion. There's an important way in which he is also broadening and transforming it. It's important to remember here that neither the Puritans nor the Founding Fathers were exactly emancipationists or abolitionists. Certainly, Jefferson, for whatever, his personal dalliances in history may have been, was no champion of race mixing. In fact, had some rather shocking things to say, actually, about both African Americans and Native Americans. And the same thing could be said, actually, about many of the most prominent Puritan preachers and intellectuals, the Mathers, for example, who were also not proto-abolitionists by any means. So there's a way in which what he's doing here is he's going back to these original values that are embodied in the Constitution, and he's saying that this is a sort of an unfolding experiment in which we're sort of trying to live up to the promises that we made at the founding of the United States, perhaps not fully understanding exactly what it was that we were promising. And that's another sense in which I think this is a bit like the covenant in the Bible, that this was sort of an unfolding relationship, a sort of unfolding agreement between the ancient Israelites and their God. So I guess what this makes clear is that there is also a kind of a political dimension to the project too. Given that that civil religion seems to be making a comeback as one way of understanding how politics and religion should be related in the United States, I think it's important that that we begin to reflect on what that tradition is, how it's changed over time, and what would be a defensible version of civil religion in the contemporary United States, which is more religiously and culturally diverse than ever. And that, I think, actually is one of the great challenges in thinking about civil religion. That is, that civil religion can no longer be just a kind of a minimal, watered down kind of Protestantism or even monotheism. It has to be something that can embrace believers and unbelievers alike, theists and non-theists alike. And that's also part of what I'm trying to think through right now in this project.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the history. How did the term civil religion originate?
The person who coined the term civil religion is the French political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract. And the way in which it then really entered into kind of social science discourse is through the work of Robert Bellah, emeritus professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, who wrote a very famous essay called The American Civil Religion in 1967, which provoked an enormous uproar that lasted for a good 20 years, and which maybe I'm in a way trying to stir up again.
Mm-hmm. What is it about civil religion that interests you? Why are you studying it, researching it?
Well, full disclosure, part of it is that Robert Bellah was my doctoral advisor, and I think it was because of having gotten to know his thinking and having read a lot of his writings on civil religion when I was a graduate student, that when I heard Obama speaking in the race speech and other speeches, I heard the echoes of King and Kennedy, I heard the echoes of Lincoln and Douglas, and I immediately connected it to this tradition of American civil religion. But of course, that's not the only reason. There are lots of interesting things to work on, from a purely scholarly point of view. And one of the reasons I chose to work on this instead of some other projects right now is because I do see civil religion as one way, possibly, a set of resources that we might use to overcome the kind of stark divides of the culture wars that have so split the United States politically over the last 20 or 25 years, and returning to a kind of a vital center, to some sort of deeper moral consensus that might allow Americans to come together again to solve some of the really serious problems that confront us at the present moment. And I think it's important, again, as a scholar, to bring, whatever knowledge and resources I have to bear into that, try to make a contribution to sort of understanding that concept of civil religion.
Okay, and you have a new theory you're working on. How does it differ or expand upon the current thinking around civil religion?
Well, there are really sort of two sets of theorists that one has to be in conversation with if one talks about civil religion. There's, on the one hand, political philosophers. Here I would point especially to Plato, Machiavelli, and Rousseau. And then there are social scientists. And here, besides Robert Bellah, I would point to the late 19th century French sociologist Émile Durkheim. And my position is a little bit different than all of theirs. So let's start with Plato. Plato wrote three blueprints for a kind of ideal republic. There's, of course, the republic, but also the statesman and the laws. And in all three of those works, he saw some kind of state-established, obligatory cult as being an integral ingredient to Republican self-government as he understood it. In fact, he went so far as to say that refusal to participate in that cult should lead to punishment, possibly even to death, if someone was sufficiently recalcitrant. Now, obviously, I would call that not civil religion, but civic religion. That's an understanding of the relationship between religion and politics, which sees, in a way, religion as being subservient to the ends of the state and really not even different, in a way, from the state. Machiavelli is often seen as another sort of big figure in the development of civil religion, but he has, not surprisingly, a more Machiavellian take on what role religion should play in supporting self-government. He sees it as perhaps a necessary evil, as a convenient instrument that can be used by rulers or ruling classes to instill certain virtues in the masses, so self-discipline and bravery and so on and so forth. Again, this sort of purely instrumental relationship, almost kind of hypocritical relationship, is not one that I would sort of morally espouse. Finally, there's Rousseau, who coins the term, but he's really almost, what his vision is kind of a sort of a Platonic neo-civic religion. So what he argues for is, again, a kind of a state-established obligatory cult. It's a kind of a watered-down deism is what he actually has in mind, with similar penalties of people who are nonconformists being expelled. So really where I part ways with all of these traditions is in vociferously defending the rights of conscience and of religious freedom, which I see as integral to what the United States has been as an experiment and as a democracy. And really, in some ways, I see the rights of conscience as the fount of all understandings of rights, rights to free speech, the right to assembly. These are all things which, in a way, are implied by the rights of conscience when they're really fully understood. What about the two social scientists, Durkheim and Bellah? Durkheim is, like many European intellectuals of his generation, was a prophet of secularization. He imagined that religion would necessarily disappear as modernity unfolded. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he was wrong about that, depending on your point of view. I think the U.S. is a very modern society, but it's not, at least in terms of the convictions of its citizens, a particularly secular society. On the contrary, and it's not at all clear that the rest of the world is going more the way of secular Europe. I think actually the United States is probably more the model for what the religious world will look like years from now. So his vision was that civil religion would replace traditional religion, but that was based on the assumption that traditional religion was going away, which I think has turned out to has proven to be incorrect. Now, Robert Bellah certainly did not share in this view that secularization would triumph, that religion would disappear. But he was in many ways still very much informed by Durkheim, believing in a way that every society, to be a cohesive society, had to have some kind of central moral consensus around which it would cohere. And he argued that civic religion was that consensus within the United States. Where I think he perhaps went a little bit off path was in not seeing that there are other rival ways of thinking about how religion and politics should be related that have played an enormous role in American history. And I've already alluded to two of them. One of them is liberal secularism or total separationism. And this is the notion that religion and politics absolutely shouldn't mix. Religious arguments have no place in the public realm. Religious actors have no place in public life. Religious symbols have no place in public spaces. And this view was already there in Jefferson's late writings. It's Jefferson, after all, who invents this famous phrase about the wall of separation between church and state, which then becomes kind of a lens through which a lot of thinking about legal thinking about church and state then is shaped during the second half of the 20th century. Another one that's very important is religious nationalism, and by this I mean the view that the U.S. is and should be a Christian nation, and the sort of implicit view that people who are not Christians, and even Christians of a particular kind, have no place in the United States. And I think one of the more remarkable statements in this line is a statement made by George W. Bush some years ago when asked whether he thought an atheist could be a good American. He expressed very serious doubts. And there are sort of more strident versions of this that are very much out there and alive in certain conservative Christian circles. People who really believe that the only way to sort of restore the health of the United States is to kind of completely Christianize it again. There are even extremely radical, though fringe versions of this that people refer to as theonomy, which believe that the United States has to be subjected to Old Testament biblical law. Adulterers have to be stoned, and the whole 9 yards. So this is very much of a fringe view, but a sort of a softer version of this, that somehow there's no place for non-believers or non-Christians of a particular kind within the United States is very much out there. And I see civil religion as a way of perhaps sort of bridging and overcoming this conflict between liberal secularists and religious nationalists, which I think, in my view, is a lot of what the culture wars of the last 25 years have really been about.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Gorski, for sharing some of your research with us.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Gorski and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another segment of the Macmillan Report, made possible by the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.